My name is Nedeau, and I work for Multnomah County Department of Community Justice Crime Victim Services Unit. I'm a program specialist working on coordinating and enhancing services for individuals who have experienced sex trafficking in our jurisdiction. I am really excited to be in front of you all today and to welcome you all to this conference in addition to all of the welcomes before, and usher you all into our panel after this talk, as well as the afternoon sessions that hopefully should elucidate a lot more of the topics that we've been highlighting this morning. So a little bit about me before I get into my chat on resiliency and how we can do justice to the folks that we're working with by better conceptualizing and bolstering it for individuals as well as service providers and our collaborative efforts. My history in this work is multifaceted. So I started a number of years ago as an intern at a local domestic violence sexual assault agency doing prevention and education work, and the agency was Raphael House, which I know that there are a number of folks there here from that agency today, and they are one of the new collaborative panel partners that we're gonna invite up here in a bit. From there, I started to do on-call work in the shelter at Raphael House. Simultaneously, I started working at Janus Youth with Runaway Youth at Harry's Mother and at Garfield House before the opening of Athena House in 2011. When Athena House opened, which formerly was a shelter and residential program that focused on everything from crisis to stabilization for youth and young adults who had experienced trafficking, I became a residential counselor there. After that experience, I went to Raphael House full-time, where I was a primary bilingual advocate and case manager. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about kind of my experiences in tandem, both at Janus Youth and Raphael House, and how that really shaped my understanding and my knowledge and my perspective on working with individuals of all ages who have experiences in the sex trades. How we as providers in a variety and multitude of systems and a variety and multitude of agencies can work together to engage and better identify so that we can bolster services for them. So without further ado, I would like to open kind of the conversation to resiliency. And I'm going to be building on the conversation that Alex started with, kind of a nuanced perspective in the diverse array of experiences and identities of youth, young adults, and adults who have experiences in the sex trades, as well as kind of honing in on what our collaborative mission and collaborative approach are. Resiliency is really a critical concept in not only understanding, but responding to sex trafficking. It applies at the individual level, but also it applies to service provider approach and collaborative efforts. For agencies, organizations, and systems are all built of individuals. Individuals I've worked with in the runaway and homeless youth system, as well as the domestic violence and sexual assault system, are some of the most resilient I've ever known. They're compassionate, they're creative, they're resourceful, they're assertive and independent, and they're hopeful. Similarly, the practitioners within the systems that we collaborate with, to name a few, DVSA providers, homeless and runaway youth services, from advocates to case managers, mental health practitioners, counselors and therapists, residential staff, mentors, law enforcement, the STU team, our district attorney's office, juvenile court counselors and parole and probation officers, Multnomah County Sheriff's Office, as well as DHS caseworkers on up, are some of the most resilient providers that I've had the privilege to work in tandem with and alongside. Not to mention their abundant passion and dedication. Today I'm going to highlight resiliency as not only the capacity to adapt and to grow, but to transform and to thrive. And as I've alluded to, we're going to spend time exploring this concept of resiliency at every level. So capacity to adapt. At the level of the individual, we know that individuals who have experienced trafficking are extremely skilled at adapting. To highlight this, and to briefly reflect on and summarize some of the components elucidated by Dr. Lutnick's previous keynote, the context, got a little bit ahead of ourselves. The context in which a youth becomes engaged or involved in the sex trades is largely due to unmet physical, emotional, social, and economic needs, such as a place to live or to stay, food, clothing, materials that convey not only comfort and stability, security, but economic, social, and cultural status. Emotionally and socially, individuals are seeking love, intimacy, affection, protection, approval, praise, connection, belonging, and community. To meet these needs for themselves, the individual who maybe is experiencing trafficking or is engaged in the sex trades, for their families, so maybe other siblings, maybe the caregivers themselves, for kiddos of their own, they've had to adapt not only to survive, but to exceed and excel, to transcend beyond their circumstances. They've sought out these resources and connections. They have the drive to thrive. As also talked about, we know that youth engaged in the sex trades have often experienced childhood physical and/or sexual abuse and neglect, potentially loss of a parent or caregiver through abandonment, divorce, incarceration, death, an unstable living environment due to maybe domestic violence and/or substance use, poverty, houselessness, and relocation of community, and different forms of social discrimination. In this way, sex trafficking can be summed up as a convergence of violence between child abuse, the experience of that individually potentially, systemic oppression, poverty, racism, gender inequities, including homophobia and transphobia, sexual assault, and domestic violence, whether that's been witnessed in the home or that's been experienced in the context of a third party, if there is one. These vulnerability factors are important to note because they can lend us insight into our efforts on primary prevention as well as in early interventions as we develop and sustain compassion for working with individuals, youth, young adults, who engage with our services. Given this knowledge, however, it's too easy for these vulnerabilities or risk factors to shape our response. Sorry. They detract from seeing the strengths or fostering further resiliency as we tend to want to protect, shield, fix. The youth that I've worked with have met their needs by integrating into street families, by finding a manager or a partner or a protector, albeit parties that may at times exploit their vulnerabilities and their needs, but nonetheless, and from the perspectives of the individual, provide resources and connections that sustain them. Components, components that may have otherwise been absent or missing in their previous experiences or in their previous circumstances. Despite elements of coercion and circumstance, these relationships, families, and communities wherein youth, young adults, and adults feel they can assert some choice, find acceptance, acknowledgement, belonging, and love. And how individuals identify and relate their experiences are complex and may be apt to shift over time between narratives of coercion, circumstance, and choice. In your folder, y'all have a visual that better highlights this. As I don't have the time to delve too deeply today, I know a number of you have been in trainings with me previously where I've talked about kind of the spectrum of exploitation to empowerment along the lines of coercion, circumstance, and choice. We need to honor how individuals identify their experience, mediating these elements of coercion, circumstance, and choice. We need to have more nuanced conversations. And if they are engaged in services, it's best that if we meet them in this place of identification, we will serve them better, drawing from their own conceptualizations of safety. If we redefine for individuals their own experiences, we often risk invalidating their resiliency, their autonomy, and their self-determination. We need to honor their expertise in their own lives and walk alongside them as they navigate what safety means to them, providing options and opportunities without judgment, assumption, or pressure. There is resiliency in navigating these prior elements as well as their current situation as they strive to meet their needs. I also want to highlight the experience of complex trauma and the adaptive behaviors and responses to navigate those prior experiences. I think too often we think of trauma responses as potentially maladaptive. And so I would like to challenge that narrative with you all. We're all familiar with trauma responses along the lines of fight, and freeze. These are normal. These are autonomic responses that in an acute experience of trauma where, there is a perception of a risk to our emotional or physical safety or survival, that each of us will experience in an acute instance of trauma. That said, the hypervigilance that's felt, the adrenaline and corresponding cortisol levels will diminish over time. We will go back to a state of equilibrium when the perceived threat has passed. For individuals who have experienced complex trauma, such as those who have experienced trafficking, it's somewhat of a Bermuda Triangle of those trauma responses: fight, flight, or freeze. At any given moment, in order to survive, I may have to go into one of those elements. I'm living in a sustained state of hypervigilance. And that has pervasive effects in terms of how folks engage with services, specifically thinking about cognition and behavior. And I would just like to highlight that those are adaptive. Those are components that individuals have used in order to survive in a variety of situations and circumstances. That is also normal when you have experienced complex trauma. Let's see. The cursor is moving quicker than I would like it to. These responses, as I said, have pervasive effects in terms of cognition, so memory and dissociation, behavior, reactivity, and disappearance. And this is all a survival mechanism that allows the individual to reestablish safety when there is a perceived threat. This is why approaches that are trauma-informed, understanding not only the ways that individual experiences of trauma at the interpersonal level, but also historical and institutional trauma. And a perspective that means curiosity and a strength-based approach is essential to working with youth, young adults, and adults engaged in the sex trades out of circumstance and coercion, or to anyone, especially in the context of any service delivery, for we know not the extent or bounds of any individual's trauma. I encourage you all to take a deep breath in your practice and reflect when we're engaged with challenging behaviors, how might this behavior be related to trauma, i.e. a trauma response in and of itself. From there, we can work back how to navigate, how to best support, how to compassionately re-engage, help teach, and develop self-awareness through identification of trauma responses, and model healthy relationships and positive relationships from a place of non-judgment, continued positive regard, and unconditional care. For example, we can say things like, I notice when we've talked about X that you tend to shut down, or XYZ. If you want to talk about it, great, and if not, that's okay too. I've known other folks who have similar experiences to you, and that is super normal. How can I help support you in those moments if we have to talk about this topic, or if similar situations arise? Youth and young adults engaged in the sex trades, when there are elements of coercion and or circumstance, and any potential trauma responses, are often efforts in adaptation. Such efforts denote an immense amount of resiliency, a profound demonstration of will and determination. At the point where youth, young adults, and adults come to engage with service providers, from DHS to runaway and homeless youth providers to domestic violence and sexual assault services, mental health care, juvenile or criminal justice, they need to be seen and acknowledged for this resiliency. So capacity to grow. How do we do that? How do we acknowledge and how do we bolster these resiliency factors? Providers have an opportunity to sustain growth and safety when the individual comes to engage with you. And I'm not saying that we as providers are the impetus or the cause for growth, just that there's an opportunity for us to engage in that process. To do so, it's important to first recognize where and how these individuals present in our community, in our services and our systems. In our community, folks access each system. The runaway and homeless youth system, maybe they're in need of a safe or warm place to stay, some food, they've had a disagreement with a parent or a foster placement or a caregiver. They don't have anywhere to turn. They need clothing, they need showers, they need services that fulfill their other needs for connection and belonging and acceptance and acknowledgement, for their health, for their wellness, and for their independence. In my time at Janus, we worked with youth who had run away and maybe were at risk because they were determining how they could be independent from a caregiver and meet their own needs. And also youth who were engaged in the sex trades but were exploring alternative routes to safety, stability, as well as long-term goals, hopes, and dreams. In domestic violence and sexual assault system, we may be engaging with individuals who are wanting to make a plan around an unsafe or abusive intimate partner, who may or may not be a third-party exploiter. They may be in need of emergency shelter or stable housing as they flee from an abusive relationship. They want something different for their children. They want a community and would be interested in a group. When I worked at Raphael House as a primary advocate, over the course of a year, I kept informal statistics about folks who were engaging in our services. What I was coming to notice is that a lot of individuals who were engaging in our shelter services had a lot of the signifiers of potentially previous experience in the quote-unquote life, or the underground sex economy and the sex trades, and potentially had indicators of trafficking. So many so that in the year 2013 to 2014, 10% of the individuals we served in shelter that year identified that in fact they were fleeing from an abusive partner who also inhabited a space of trafficker or an exploiter. And an additional 27% had enough indicators where, as a team, we were making plans and trying to offer resources and navigate support that would meet their more complex or layered experiences. I say this to highlight that there are a lot of providers in the room from different systems, from different agencies, from different perspectives, and that individuals who have these experiences are walking into all of these doors. In mental health, maybe they're seeking support for symptoms of depression or anxiety. In DHS, there was an abuse or neglect report about them or their children. DHS self-sufficiency, they need assistance with TANF, with SNAP, with WIC, the jobs program, etc. Juvenile and criminal justice, maybe they got a charge for a tangential offense that was drug possession or theft or assault. In any of these services or systems, they may not identify themselves or their experiences. They may not identify themselves because of feelings of stigma or shame. They may feel judgment from a provider. They may have a deep sense of distrust in systems and fear repercussions. They may have had previous experiences in the foster care system, experiences with the legal system, the medical or mental health system, with service providers that did not serve their needs, maybe leveraged expectations or mandates that made their lives more complicated or traumatic, that didn't meet them where they were at and didn't honor their resiliency. And so they are going to be maybe weary of engaging in these systems or only partially engage. This is another reason that youth, young adults, and adults don't come to engage in services, especially population-specific services. So they may not know that there are services out there to meet their specific needs. Whether we're talking about a 12-year-old, and many 12-year-olds are not necessarily aware that there are specific organizations and specific programs in our community that can meet their needs. When we talk about trafficking, and as Alex highlighted earlier, trafficking isn't a term that resonates with most folks. And so when we have population-specific services and how we discuss those as providers and how we market those and make those available and accessible to individuals is important. Also, as previously noted, the desire to engage in one facet of services that may or may not include a total or immediate departure from the sex trades for a variety of reasons, whether they be economic, emotional, social, etc., is also to be expected. There's an amazing diversity in identity, experience, and need. For providers to work effectively with individuals Capacity to grow is centered in the provider recognizing areas of individual asset, strength, and partnering with the individual to develop or enhance these areas, as opposed to focusing on risk or pathology deficit. We're not trying to fix them. We do this first by honoring the individual and developing a relationship with that specific individual, their unique needs, their unique strengths. Facets of resiliency that ultimately promote safety include social connection and competency, so responsiveness, flexibility, give and take, boundaries, setting them for themselves and respecting them for others. Empathy, caring from an external focus. Communication that is proactive and reflective, reciprocity, as well as humor. Problem solving, making plans, asking for help or support, critical and creative thinking, short-term and long-term thinking and reasoning. Autonomy as well, so decision-making, sense of identity, self-efficacy, self-awareness, task mastering, distancing from adversity. Finally, sense of direction, purpose, and hope. Some examples that come to mind from previous practice include helping youth and young adults navigate pre-existing relationships in healthier ways. This involves discussion, followed by trial and error, probably followed by more discussion. Individuals may want to sustain relationships with others that providers may not believe are the safest for them, right? So family, friends, partners. It could be street families, it could be a trafficker. Many of these relationships are going to endure beyond the scope of any services. So we do individuals a disservice or an injustice if we aren't willing to meet them where they're at and figure out how to better navigate or better plan for or better engage in a healthier way in those relationships. Youth, young adults, and adults likely have insight into these unhealthy dynamics in some of their relationships. We can help by discussing these realities from all sides with individuals without judgment. We can discuss what the needs are of these individuals and how they are getting those needs fulfilled by these relationships, right? So what does attachment look like? How has their attachment been fortified? What experiences, insights, supports? What they want in the short term or the long term from these relationships. What is their ideal form of said relationship or of others? How these relationships might support or hinder goals. We can remind the folks that we work with that what they deserve from their relationships, if we're hearing concerning components, and reflect back what they've already disclosed as their ideal form of a relationship. At the end of the day, individuals are going to make their own decisions and engage with other folks. So we don't want that to be a secret, because that proportionately decreases safety. It becomes a culture of secrecy. Being a safe person that a youth, a young adult, or an adult can return to engage around a conversation of what safer engagement might look like with these various parties can go a long way. Even poor experiences can provide light bulb moments and highlight opportunities for more discussion and growth. It's all about active listening, which I know many of you are familiar with this concept. So, ORs, open-ended questions, the how, the what, the why, affirmations, and that's not based in judgment. That's not saying, I'm so proud of you. That's conveying to an individual how hard they've worked, how determined they've been, how much they've overcome, really placing the individual at the center. What is their value and their significance that they've ascribed to successes, to heartbreaks, to setbacks? Reflections. Reflecting back what you're hearing, making sure that you're on the same page. Also thinking about kind of, in the past, what does this look like? And in the future, what could this look like? And finally, summaries. Summaries are extremely important because they not only allow us to highlight and encapsulate all that has occurred in an interaction or in a conversation, make sure that we heard correctly, offers the opportunity to further clarify and thus relationship build if not. It also provides an opportunity for us to, as providers, denote or highlight action steps. So that's both for the individual we're working with, what their working on, as well as a provider, what I need to be working on. As providers, we have the opportunity to model healthy relationships as we engage with the folks we serve, and to also identify options or ideas for safer engagement and interactions. Highlighting and modeling healthy relationship components such as boundaries, consistency, empathy, trust can help individuals navigate those outside the realms of service provision in their lived realities. Specific example that comes to mind is in my time at Janus and at Athena House, there was a policy where youth were not allowed to have access to their cell phones while in the program. That was well-intentioned, right? It was out of a concern for safety, that youth were going to share each other's information, that youth were going to share the confidential location of the house, that youth were going to post online. That said, it created a culture where youth were not engaged in creating a healthy dialogue about how to navigate relationships or my interaction and my engagement with this social and technological device and the people on the other side of it. When they could walk into the world and they would have access again, but they couldn't have those conversations in the context of a safe environment. I would encourage you all to think about your own policies or your programmatic expectations and guidelines in a similar way. How are we inadvertently creating barriers? How are we not highlighting and honoring an individual's resiliency? How can we better meet them where they're at and grow and build those capacities? In terms of problem solving, it's important to note that we can't meet all of the needs of the youth, young adults, or adults that we have, at least not as a singular provider, right? That's why we all need to work together. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. What we can do is to highlight for youth how they've problem solved in the past, right? They're resilient. They've gotten here. They're extremely creative. We can also offer existing resources, which may involve referrals and warm handoffs. This is the crux of a safety plan, which is drawing from an individual's expertise and their lived experience, in highlighting services where we can supplement or offset. This conveys a few different things. First, we see the individual's creativity, their perseverance, and their historical problem-solving capacities, and we know that that can be utilized in the future. Second, we become a partner to that youth, to that young adult, to that individual, to that adult, in fortifying a stronger relationship through affirmation and through collaboration. It also provides the opportunity to slow down any potential for negative decision-making, as believed potentially or perceived by a provider, related to urgency or potentially perceived crisis. What happens when you go meet up with that friend? What are you worried about? If you do meet up or if you don't meet up, validate the concerns and the desires and the expectations. Connect the short-term goals, needs, with the long-term goals and needs of the individual. What happens if things don't go as you hoped? I know you have an important housing meeting coming up. Is that going to impact your ability to make it to that meeting or to engage? Or is going to meet up with your friend going to change kind of what your perspective on your future options are? I'm genuinely curious about those, and I'm not ascribing judgment. I'm not saying what an individual should do. I'm merely trying to understand more about what is their focus. We can walk through what it will all look like in the short term and long term, right? So we can highlight those different options, those different potential outcomes. What happens if you miss your bus back and you don't make it to the meeting? It might be hard to reschedule, etc. Lastly, this builds skills for any similar scenarios or situations in the future. In terms of autonomy, we want to provide options whenever possible. And I recognize that we all have constraints that are programmatic, that are related to licensure, that are related to legal mandate, but options might be as simple as the meeting time, the meeting place. Maybe it's not comfortable to meet in your office. Maybe it's only comfortable to meet via text message. Maybe it's more comfortable to meet on a bench while the individual you're working with can smoke cigarettes. How can we be flexible to meet folks where they're at and provide options whenever possible, no matter how small? Honor that the individual is going to make their own decisions, which may differ from your own hopes or expectations as a provider. It's not your journey, it's theirs, and we want to walk alongside them. If a negative outcome does result, it's an opportunity for further learning and further discussion, which is the crux of a relationship. Having judgment or being frustrated, upset, disappointed, or setting an overly protective limit can detract from an individual's agency and their desire to engage with you as to their decision-making process or options they're exploring. The self-determination and opportunity to succeed along self-identified goals and initiatives will only enhance self-efficacy and furthered resilience, that capacity to grow. Thinking back, we can always be there to process about an unintended consequence or undesirable outcome. This all highlights the trust that we have for the individual, as well as our belief in their own individual innate capacity. In terms of sense of direction, purpose, and hope, reflections and affirmations from providers as to strengths, and those are proactive and those are frequent, as well as about their milestones, are important. Reflect on and celebrate each and every success. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. Provide and encourage opportunities to explore new things, to endeavor, interests, hobbies, connect those to long-term goals, and be prepared to be flexible. Those might shift. Foster a sense of possibility and interest. If we shift our focus from fixing to working collaboratively with the individual and allowing them to guide, an individual-centered approach to not only goals but successes, as well as providing compassion during setback and holding hope, not only will individuals grow, but we will sustain in our work. This directly impacts us in a service provision capacity. We've got to manage our own concerns, fears, and expectations. So practices that grow relationships and foster resiliency, first and foremost, to focus on those strengths, focus on those assets. We need to refuse risk and deficit and pathology as our focus in service provision. We need to meet basic needs. Thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? We can't continue to move up the rungs or levels from the physiological or the safety needs to esteem, to belonging, to self-actualization. First, we've got to provide basic needs, food, shelter, etc. Relationships are key to help guide that individual through those levels. Genuine interest and curiosity cannot be overstated. Hearing where an individual is, where they've been and how they've gotten where they are, where they're going, and ideas as how to get there, get the whole picture. Listening, again, can't plug enough open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, and summaries. Motivational interviewing. Cultural responsivity and humility. We need for services providers represented therein and system leadership that reflect identities and experiences of the youth, young adults, and adults that we serve. And we all need to be proactive in listening to, learning about the individuals we're serving, their perspectives and lived realities, their communities, so we can best meet their needs in context. Compassion and understanding. In terms of recognizing the potential impacts of past trauma and assuming the best with the individuals that we're working with. We need to respect and honor their expertise. Partnering, not dictating. Consistency and boundaries. We need to let folks know when you're going to show up, how you're going to show up, where you're going to show up, and follow through on that. We also need to let the individual know what our limitations are. All of this fortifies trust. Opportunities for meaningful participation include responsibility, which increases self-efficacy, right? So, for example, if an individual is really social and community-oriented in the context of your services, it may be a meaningful responsibility for them to help orient new participants in your services. That gives them a sense of responsibility, and it also fulfills kind of what they're already aspiring to do. It also creates community. Options and decision-making. We need to provide, again, options for that decision-making process. And finally, voice and being heard. In individual meetings with feedback that is shared with the team, as well as program evaluations and incorporating feedback when there is a patterned response is extremely important in order to better inform our services, to grow our practice and approach. If the individual leads and we walk alongside, meeting them where they're at, providing a space to listen and engage without judgment, offering options, etc., we won't feel all of the pressure related to somebody's success or the outcomes. Because it's partnership and we're recognizing as well as collaboratively addressing their needs. For all of this, I want to highlight the need to appreciate and celebrate successes. This is all relative to the individual in their own self-identified goals and where they're at, no matter how incremental. This could be connecting with a provider or a safe person after a challenging interaction, reaching back out to one of you. Say a family member, partner, friend, service provider. Going to and or self-advocating for themselves at, say, a wraparound meeting. Just being present can be a huge success for the individuals that we're working with. Simply applying for a job or applying for a housing opportunity. Setting up a preventative doctor's appointment and not using the ER. Or even using urgent care as opposed to the ER can be a success that we can celebrate, that we can reflect back to the individual. We see them. The possibilities are really endless, so I'm going to leave that to you, and we're going to do an activity about that at the end of this chat. For other individuals, sustaining in therapy or in school or in a job for a period of time, maybe that's a month, maybe that's 3 months, maybe it's a year, etc. Getting an apartment, getting a promotion, graduating from a program or a school. These are all examples of successes that we can highlight and amplify and reflect on with the individuals we serve. So capacity to transform. We need to not only think about this work and our roles at the individual or the provider level, we need to think about it at the system level as well. The youth, young adults, and adults we work with are likely to engage with many, if not most, or all of the systems represented here today. As I already talked about, runaway and homeless youth, domestic violence, sexual assault, mental health, DHS, the legal system. In recognizing that many of them will come to engage with so many of us as they strive to meet their needs, to seek safety on their own terms, and to explore the possibilities and potential for belonging, for purpose, and fulfillment, it becomes clear that collaboration across providers, systems, and sectors is essential to serving them. Collaboration can be challenging, however. There are different perspectives, there are different approaches, and there is an abundance and techniques. And in a collaboration, where there's an abundance of voices, there's an immense amount of expertise and possibility for transformation on the individual level as well as in our agencies and across our systems. In order to transform and serve individuals better, we have to be willing to have hard conversations with one another. True collaboration involves direct and ethical communication, not spinning and assuming or just disengaging, right? We gotta push ourselves for the betterment of the individuals we're serving. We need to reach out when there are negative interactions. Because we shouldn't be putting the individual that we're serving in that position, and there are valuable resources on the other end of that phone call or in that other door that we want to be able to help utilize and creatively provide. We need cooperation, we need constructive feedback, and we need accountability to flex and to change to meet each individual's needs where they're at. This is a process of simultaneous and parallel transformation. In order to do that, we have to begin by building relationships with one another in this room and bringing this back to our agencies. So the same facets that I talked about in terms of resiliency apply in the context of a system. Amongst one another, we need connection to one another on teams, across programs, across providers, across systems. We're all potential referring partners. We all have different areas of expertise, perspectives. This helps provide for the individual's needs, the folks that we serve, and also enhances their ability to reach out and navigate these resources on their own. It creates community for the individual and for the providers, especially as relationships are bound to ebb and flow over time. In terms of problem solving, we think about, whether it's wraparound supports and wraparound meetings, or we think about consultation, case consultation and coordination efforts. We think about general referrals. We have the opportunity to bring together diverse resources and perspectives to creatively address the needs and respond or engage. We need each other. Autonomy. Each service has its own expertise and its own purview. Honoring those and finding points of alignment is central. We're not going to agree on everything, but what can we agree on? The sense of purpose and hope that I think most individuals, if not all individuals in this room, share are opportunities, enhanced or increased opportunities for self-determination and safety, and lives free of exploitation or violence. Again, this all starts with genuine interest and curiosity, listening, cultural responsivity and humility, compassion and understanding, assuming the best of one another, respect and honoring expertise, consistency and boundaries. Modeling healthy relationships is key in our interactions with the individuals that we serve. The same applies to practitioners because these individuals are going to be at the meetings with us. They're going to see how we engage. We're going to refer to one another and we're going to case consult by standards of confidentiality and privacy practices, of course. Bolstering resiliency is a process, not any one program. Research backs this up. Study from the Full Frame Initiative looked at success and how individuals who are engaged in programs felt that their success was actualized. And in that study, 85% of individuals identified that it was the relationship that helped them be successful. Only 15% of participants in the study identified that it was the program structure that helped them be successful. That's immensely important for us to reflect on, about what are the components of sustained relationship building and how does that help somebody not only adapt and grow, but transform and thrive. This process involves all of us as partners, not only to the individuals who we serve, but also one another. It takes flexibility and creativity, and it may be different for each individual. Stages of change are also a nonlinear process. Systems are well-intentioned, but they get in the way inadvertently because they want to fix, they want to protect, they're focusing on risks and deficiencies. They move too quickly through a process, which may serve to inadvertently invalidate an individual's experience, their autonomy, and their resiliency. And as highlighted before, this can cause somebody to disengage, withdraw, disappear, peace out. It's an unintended impact. We need to slow down and walk alongside the individual on the same path. It's their path. Those are the key elements to transformation in this work. Collaboration is especially hard when, as individual providers, we may be experiencing burnout, vicarious trauma, and compassion fatigue. That tends to make us shrink into ourselves and take on a lot of responsibility for the other individuals that we're engaging with. Again, relationships with one another on the provider level can help to mitigate that because we can reach out for support when we need it, and we can also reach out to celebrate successes. There's give and take. Our resiliency is bolstered when we can reach out. The individuals we serve need and deserve our collaboration. So what does this all mean in terms of the capacity to thrive? At the community level, if we do build intentional and collaborative relationships, we can decrease barriers and in so doing increase safety, self-efficacy, belonging, and actualization. We can help youth, young adults thrive. These relationships support not only the youth and young adults and adults who access our services or engage in our systems, they serve to create spaces for critical dialogues as to the root causes of sex trafficking and how to respond. In partnership and collaboration with the individuals we serve and each other, we can evaluate, revise, and implement new policies so that the same circumstances and coercive elements that make individuals vulnerable to exploitation and or trafficking are mitigated. Central in these endeavors, we find social and racial justice work, including anti-racism initiatives, LGBTQ rights activism, gender equity, access to housing, gainful employment with equal pay, protection for immigrants, criminal justice reform, as well as dating and intimate partner violence prevention and intervention efforts, which include healthy relationship and sexuality promotion, as well as comprehensive sexual and reproductive health education, as well as access to care. I cannot emphasize enough how important the voices of individuals with lived experiences in the sex trades are to these efforts. From lived experience to collaborative response, relationships are essential to better conceptualize and bolster resiliency for the individuals and for our community.